Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kimberly Cloud Show. I'm your host, Kimberly Cloud. I have a very, very special guest for the show today. Can you go ahead and announce to the world who you are and where you're calling from?
I'm Mark Anthony Powers, and I'm calling from Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Okay, welcome to the show. I wanted to go ahead and talk about your past leading up into what you do in your present.
Mhm. My past, I'm a retired physician. I specialize in pulmonary and critical care medicine. I grew up in New Hampshire. I trained in North Carolina. I worked in North Carolina for my whole career, retired from Duke University as an associate professor, Emeritus, and then I started taking classes.
Wow. So you got your degrees while at Duke University. I always wanted to go to Duke University. I
Actually,
used to live, huh?
my degrees are from Cornell and Dartmouth. I
Okay.
worked at Duke,
Cool. You worked at Duke as a professor, right?
associate professor.
Cool. So what is it that you would like to tell your audience? Because I know that we talked a little bit before the show, and I hear that you have a book that you wanted to talk about, and it must be on your heart. Can you tell us a little bit about that book since you sped through your whole life?
Well, there are other things I can tell you about my life. I'm a master beekeeper, and I volunteer as an extension gardener volunteer, master gardener volunteer in the community at our community garden to help teach people about raising vegetables and other edible food, plants. So those are the things have done in my spare time. And since I've retired, I've taken, as I said, several classes in a lot of different things that three of them were in how to write a novel. And so I've written three novels. They're medical thrillers. And I can say that there are other medical thrillers out there for people to read, but most of the authors haven't lived those medical times that I have. They may have read about them, they may have done their research, but they haven't lived through them. And I think that makes me unique in writing the medical thrillers. Um, the first one I wrote is A Swarm in May, and it takes
Tell
place.
me about that.
It takes place in the late. Oh, it's the first one I published. It's not the first one I wrote, but it's the first one I decided to publish. It takes place in the late 1990s, 1998, in North Carolina, and its theme is about systemic racism and the whitewashing of history in America. The protagonist is a white man, and he learns how little he knows about racism, and he has to learn that from an intern that he's supposedly teaching critical care medicine to. The the family of one of their very sick patients is a racist, and the intern has to deal with his insults and the difficulties, and then with an escalation of threats that come from him. And so our protagonist is trying to take care of sick people and deal with racism, and he's also learning from his intern um, about the extra burdens that are placed on a black man who's trying to learn medicine and take care of sick people. Uh,
Is this based on a true story or this is non
so
fiction?
this is fiction.
Okay.
There are references to true stories. One of the references is to the Wilmington Massacre, which took place in 1898, 100 years before this is set. I don't know if you're familiar with the Wilmington Massacre, but it's when a town that was successfully integrated in business and government and everything else
In
was,
PA, right?
no, in North Carolina.
It happened in North Carolina? Okay.
Yeah. There was a coup by a white supremacist group that was backed by people in the government and people in high places in North Carolina, and they murdered many of the citizens and burned their houses to the ground and basically took over the government in 1898. This is probably the first and maybe one of the few coups in America where the government was replaced. Um, so our protagonist, Phineas Mann, who's the person through all my books so far, he has to learn about this he learns about it from his intern's fiance, who's doing a paper on the subject, and he learns about other issues to do with racism.
You know what it sounds like to me? That is a bestseller because you have a lot of climaxing, because a lot of people they sort of don't like to talk about racism, but to read about it in your view, it just, and to hear about it through your mouth, it just sounds like it just goes up and down with the climax in the book, like with all the challenges that this person goes through as being an African American man, right?
Well, the protagonist is a white professor who's teaching an African American man, but he is also learning from him because he realizes how ignorant he is on the subject of race,
Yes.
and he has to learn. I couldn't write it from the perspective of a black person, but I thought I could write it as a white person who also wanted to learn and needed to learn, and so that our protagonist learns from the other character book, and he meets other people too that help him in his learning journey. He meets a man, a son of one of his patients, who's trying to start a restaurant and having trouble getting loans, and so there are other references to it as well.
If you had to take one excerpt out of the book, which you have already, what is the most powerfulest plot or climax portion of the book before we move on to the next book you wrote?
Well, I won't give the climax away.
Understood.
Yeah, it's called A Swarm in May for reasons. The book also has a swarm of bees in it, and that's captured by our protagonist and his son, who wants to be a beekeeper also. And the bees become one of the characters in the book, and they're part of the story that goes through it. And the climax has to do with the accelerating threats that the white supremacist makes against individuals, and then the hospital, and our protagonist, our main character, has to deal with those, and that's the climax.
Understood. And tell us about your next book you written.
Okay. The second book was called Breath and Mercy, and it actually is the first book I wrote, but I didn't think it was ready to be published, so I rewrote it multiple times, and finally decided this past spring that it was ready to be published. It's the same protagonist, Phineas Mann's life earlier on. It starts with him as a medical student and goes through his internship, residency in the first years of his practice. He has to. He moves to North Carolina. He moves to New Orleans. He starts out in Boston where he's training. He moves to North Carolina for his training. While he's in North Carolina, the AIDS pandemic begins. The first cases of AIDS arrive, and he sees them, and he sees all that happens. You may not be old enough to remember what happened when AIDS began, but there were a lot of really bad feelings against the victims of AIDS back in the 1980s. And so he's dealing with a huge influx of patients that have this condition. He's working really hard. And then the hospital he's working in New Orleans is hit by a hurricane, and that completely paralyzes the city, paralyzes the hospital. And he's working in a hospital for five days without any power, without any telephones, without any plumbing. And he's doing critical care medicine, trying to take care of sick people, and having to make some very difficult decisions about his patients under those circumstances. And those decisions come back to haunt him. They come back to threaten his life. well, everything he holds dear in his life. So that's that story, and it's the same protagonist, but at a younger age than the one in A Swarm in May.
You know what I can't wait to see, because I'm a little eye lazy. I would want to see both of those books as a movie or a play. Are you getting to that for the future?
I think they'd make very good movies. I think they'd be good, or a good series. A play would be a challenge to do. I suppose it could be done for maybe for A Swarm in May, but it'd be interesting to see how they would set the play up, how they would make the setting and on stage. But I could see both as movies.
Tell me about your last book. Well, not really last, because I know you're going to write more.
Actually, I have a fourth one that I'm workshopping right now that I can mention it afterward, but it's probably at least 6 months, maybe a year from being published, because I'm still working on it. So this was the third one I wrote. It's called Nature's Bite. And its theme is about climate change. And it takes place in the year 2024. So it's a little bit in the future.
Whoa.
And it's the same protagonist, but he's an older man now. He's 70 years old, because, he started out as a medical student, and now he's, 45 years into his medical career. And this one, as I said, is set in 2024. And it's set at the end. I wrote it in 2020, the first draft of it. And I wrote it before the 2020 election. And I wrote it as though there were a different outcome to the election. And so I set it at the end of a second Republican presidency in 2024. So it's a winding down of a Republican presidency. It's everything that played out if there'd been a different president in the office. It's fiction, of course, because you know how the 2020 election came out. But
I know.
I wasn't sure how it was going to come out, and I was trying to imagine what it would be like in the year 2024 if it came out differently.
Understood.
So,
wow. So we done talked for 12 minutes and 56 seconds, and you done told me about 3 books about the same people in their past, present, and future. It is an honor to go through those books, to talk about that. Now, I have to ask, because we're crunched for time. Where do you see yourself? What do you see yourself not only doing with yourself for the future, but these books for the future?
Well, these books have just been launched in the last 18 months. So right now I'm hoping to get help promoting them. And that's been some of my effort recently, but I'm also trying to get my 4th novel finished. And so that's going to keep me busy for another year. I have an idea for a 5th novel, but it's really just a seed right now. And we'll see what happens with it. It'll be the first one I'll write with a different main character.
You know what I appreciate? You took the time out to learn about another race, and it's hard to get that these days, but the fact that you studied, you may not be African American, but you studied about African Americans, you researched, you made a story up based on climax and everything else that comes in with a book, and you wrote a thick book. It's not a small short story, it's a thick book. And if you're out there watching, you guys, I would take the time out to read his story, because, like, seriously, he has 3 books that talk about the past, present, and the future of a protagonist. And I think it's worthwhile. Wow. So what have you learned from actually writing these books about your characters within the books?
Well, let me say, if people want to read more about me, I have a website, and it's www.markanthonypowers.com. And that'll tell about my books and more about me on that. So let me just get that out there. And it also take you links to get the books. Please use that website. It's I think you'll find it enjoyable. What have I learned? Well, I've learned a lot writing the books. I've, of course, have had to do some research and reading. I read some great books. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, Black Man in a White Coat by Damon Tweedy. I've taken classes on racism in America, but I've also taken classes in beekeeping and classes in gardening, and those are all things that I learned after I retired. Retirement does not have to mean watching television, going fishing, and playing golf all day. I think when I was approaching retirement, I was thinking it's like a kid in a candy shop. There are so many things out there, so many treats, so many things to get a taste of. You should think about not going away from a job, but going towards something new, new opportunities, new things to learn about, new activities where you can help others. So I think that's one of the things I've learned as I started.
Well, and doctor, if you had to give a piece of it, last question, if you had to give a piece of advice based on you becoming a doctor, you learning and writing books and doing all type beekeeper, they're underrated. I commend you, on everything you've accomplished. But if you had to give a key point or piece of advice to the young entrepreneur out there, based on your whole entire career where you made mistakes, what kind of advice would you give them?
Advice to an entrepreneur. Well, I'm not an entrepreneur. The ones that I know that are successful work very hard, and they try to learn about what they're doing, learn everything they can about. And it's not easy, and there'll be hurdles to get over, and if you want to be successful, you have to get over those and then move on. That's what I've learned from watching entrepreneurs and around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some successful ones.
So tell me, how can we reach you?
Well, my website, as I said earlier, www.markanthonypowers.com, has a link to send me messages by email, and that's probably the best way.
Okay. So you have a fourth book coming out within 8 months to a year, and let's see. You right?
I hope so.
Okay. It's been an honor. Stay on the line. I wanted to thank everybody that joined my show and stayed on my page. So stay on the line, and you guys take care. I'll leave you up and I'll cut you off, and y'all take care, be safe, and I will see you guys later. Bye. Okay.